Joshua Clover, somebody once said to me about him that he pops. So that's kind of like a natural introduction. There's nobody who I've found more intellectually and otherwise stimulating in my encounters with him, even when they're far between. And it's not always an easy thing to be so stimulated, but it's always a thing that one feels happy to have had happen. And I'm really excited to share that with all of you, some of that encounter, which you already started a little bit of. Thank you all very much for your patience. Thank you, Allison Kiesel and Maria Carrig, for helping to arrange this, and all of you students for being here and being ready, and other colleagues and everyone else. So without me getting in the way anymore, I'll give a fuller introduction later tonight. Joshua does all kinds of things. He writes for high, low, and middle, and we're all grateful for all of it. I am. So please welcome Joshua Clover.
Even though we've met, I want to say hi and thank you all for coming. I really do. I appreciate it. People show up, and it's nice to meet them. I'm really grateful to Rick for arranging this. Rick is a special person and a good friend, and I'm very grateful to him for having me here. And the chances we have to see each other a few and far between, and so that's a nice bonus. But it's nice to have a chance to sort of talk through the stuff I'm interested in, which I'm going to try and do today. This talk is a little bit, I don't know what the word is. I'm not sure what audience it's looking for. On the one hand, it's got some kind of fancy theoretical, historical stuff that it sort of zips by pretty fast as if everyone knows it. I'm not even sure I know it, but if there's stuff you find utterly perplexing or went by too quickly, please just note it down, and I'll try and give a better explanation of it afterwards. At the same time, it's very much pitched at the present moment, as you'll see, even though it's set insofar as talks can be set in 1967, which was an interesting year in many ways, including in baseball, but I'm not going to talk. I get raked to laugh at that. I'm not going to cover any baseball today. So, yeah, this talk was written a few months ago, which is to say before the really striking events of the last couple of days, especially at University of Missouri, which I am profoundly fascinated by. Has people been following what's been happening at University of Missouri? No? Oh my God. Short summary. So, University of Missouri is the flagship campus of state of Missouri, the state system. It's got a very successful football team that's in the SEC, Southeast Conference, which makes a lot of money. There have been a lot of racist incidents on campus, as I think is true on almost every campus. And there was a general sense that the chancellor and president were not being responsive to these. In fact, we're just sort of ignoring them, downplaying them, refusing to address student concerns. There was more and more unrest on campus. The English department voted no confidence in the chancellor a few days ago. A few days before that, a graduate student had gone on hunger strike, demanding that the administration recognize and confront these racist episodes on campus, which sort of peaked with someone smearing a swastika in shit on the wall of a dorm. And still nothing happened. And then the football team, of which has 84 players, of which 58 are African American, announced they would not be participating in any more football-related activities until the president stepped down. 48 hours later, he was gone. This is an amazing story, right? There have been many, many calls for bad university presidents to sort of be gotten rid of after they've done terrible things. At my own school, where I teach, UC Davis, our chancellor ordered the police to pepper spray a bunch of kids who were seated on the quad as part of the Occupy movement. They were literally seated there. Some of them were already handcuffed, and they got pepper sprayed, ended up in the hospital, and nothing happened, right? She still has her job, it's fine. And yet the football team, working in collaboration with these other groups, succeeded in getting, like in 48 hours, it was like swatting a fly. I'm not quite sure what to say about it, except it's a striking episode of student power. It's important to remember student athletes are students too. is of student power in collaboration with faculty, in collaboration with staff, and in response to the issue of race and racism, which seems right now to be, I think it's obvious enough, the livest sort of social political issue we have in the country over the course of the last at least since the events in Ferguson, Missouri last year, if not for very much longer. So that's a bit of the context for this talk. And yet it's really going to be about philosophy. I think I'm supposed to keep this close so it's getting recorded properly. We'll hope this works. This is called The Balance of Forces in 1967. Now, I want to talk about a complex of problems that are very much with us today, that have been with us for a very long time. The complex has multiple axes, but let me pull out a couple of them to start with. One axis is the question of racialized domination. And I'm going to keep on using that term racialized and racialization as a way to try and avoid saying the word race in a way that presumes there's actually such a thing as race, that it's in fact somehow genetically or metaphysically true that some people are black and some people are white, which is a greatly disputed concept which I'm going to try and avoid by talking about racialization, and that'll become clear later on. So one axis is the question of racialized domination, immiseration, and destruction, and struggles around this question, struggles which today in the US are best known under the ambiguous heading of the Black Lives Matter movement. The other axis tracks the question of the form of struggle itself, the question of what shape political antagonism can and does take. And I want to suggest that these two axes align in a tense and transformative way in the 1960s in ways which provide a useful reflection or refraction on the present moment. In perhaps the most famous meditation on the opposition of determination on the one hand and free agency on the other, Marx says that, on the one hand, people make their own history, but on the other, that they do not do so as they wish, but rather within circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. So that moment of sort of ability to act freely to change the world and the constriction of the world that you've inherited, that's made, that's resistant, that is the way it is, that has inertia, that you didn't choose, and which constricts and responds to your actions. Now, I'm peculiarly interested in the circumstances existing in the late 60s and the changes, particularly in the material recomposition of class and race in the United States and elsewhere, recompositions which were, in this moment, not just changing, but at the pivot of a historical transformation of the ground for politics itself. It may seem strange, therefore, that I mean to start with ethics. The trolley problem is one of the better-known thought experiments in ethical philosophy. It's formulated in 1967, the date of our talk, by Philippa Foot, an Oxford professor, granddaughter of the United States President Grover Cleveland. And the trolley problem has also spawned a number of variations, many formal studies. It's become a subject for cognitive science, neuroethics, popular psychology. It's recently returned in the debate concerning the programming of self-driving cars. It's universally glossed pretty much as it appears on its own Wikipedia page. That's the language you have up there, the summary of the problem. You'll see that the version provided by Foot is a bit different, but not substantively so. As it happens, I think the trolley problem proves an interesting and ambiguous opportunity to think about order and disorder on the balance of forces in 1967. So there is a trolley coming down the street. I'm now swiftly moving sort of an allegory of the trolley problem for social struggle, as you'll see. There is a trolley coming down the street, an aspect of social life, now evident as a remorseless, inhuman agent of death. There is its path, set in advance by powers not presently in evidence, but nonetheless predictable. And there is the moment when human agency enters. That's that little switch you see up there. the opportunity to intercede via willed activity and alter the outcome. So you'll, I think, see already, I would suspect, my sort of crude shift to the historical register, wherein the trolley problem can be taken as a meditation on determinism and agency, which I hope to suggest is also a theoretical register of the political opposition between organization and spontaneity. So we have a lot of opposition set up now. Agency versus determinism, spontaneity and organization, and we'll get a couple more oppositions. We probably won't resolve them all, certainly not in the next half hour, but I do hope this sort of series of transcodings discloses some critical ambiguities within these concepts. To think about our own present, we'll need to wrestle with these ambiguities. We'll be satisfied to maybe just name them and see for a moment what poetry was trying to do with these problems. In fact, as I mentioned before, we are going to work our way toward talking about poetry in a few minutes, if the trolley problem is not already a certain kind of poetry. Now, there have been no shortage of long, hot summers. 1967 featured almost 160 so-called race riots, which is always a contested term, which is the most on record. 1967 is Black America's 1968 in many regards. Counterculture with a vengeance. The most memorable are the Newark riots and the Great Rebellion in Detroit. They are in part remembered in a series of poems that have endured into the present, as well as many that have not. Perhaps there is no better measure of the moment's magnetism than the fact that Maya Angelou, a compass of sorts, would feel pressed to point back at the events in her poem Riot 60s from 1971. If you know Maya Angelou's poetry, you'll recognize that this is very much not in what would become her famous style, and yet somehow she felt compelled to sort of turn to this problem, as did many, many poets. In 1967, we have not yet arrived within what's called the new era of riots. This dates to the 70s or maybe the 80s, when the riot recovers its 17th and 18th century primacy. In 1967, the strike, which is always the alternative to the opposition of the riot, the strike is experiencing an autumnal flare. It cannot yet be known that this will be the last golden gleam before winter comes for the US labor movement. Retrospectively, we can see that within a situation of global volatility for which a leading cause and ongoing consequence is the deindustrialization of the United States, other overdeveloped nations. In this moment, strike and riot are vying for pride of place within what Charles Tilly calls the repertoire of tactics for collective action, right? So he says, like, every society has a repertoire of tactics, of which some are the lead and some are lesser ones. And over the course of the West, for a long time, the riot was the leading tactic in the repertoire of action until about maybe 1830. Hard to date it exactly. And then the strike takes over and is the leading tactic in the repertoire until the 1970s, and then it shifts back. So the former, the strike, is identified with a kind of ascetic discipline, an administrative structure, formal or informal. The latter, the riot, is affectively charged with a sense of chaos, violence, indiscipline, de-repression. Order and disorder would probably be the appropriate opposition there. So we can continue from there with our sort of parallel or allegorical clusters of concepts. The strike is a specter of determination, of the production by the logic of capitalism of its own gravediggers, the labor movement, the proletariat, brought together in association on the great factory floors, exploited there and put in combination for the benefit of capital, a combination which will later allow them to organize against capital. The riot, contrarily, is famously guilty of voluntarism. There's no particular, capitalism doesn't force the riot to happen, or so you hear. It's just a moment, it's a spasm. It's often described as spasmodic. It just arises from nowhere and goes back there. It has no sort of ongoing force. So it has the ability to act, but without the tracks of determination that coordinate and direct this accrued capacity. The strike, then, is the very figure of organization, both logically and its historical role within the class mass party sequence, wherein labor strikes and class organization lead to labor-based parties. In fact, you still have parties called Labor Right in England and various places around the world, which hypothetically will seize power and seize control of the government and so on. The imperative organize has as its unspoken object the strike. The riot provides the equivalent figure for spontaneism. The EndNotes collective of sort of political theorists suggests four main characteristics of spontaneism, linking it directly to the problem of determination and agency. The four are: it is unpredictable because freely willed, disruptive, it is creative, generating new content for struggle, and correspondingly it generates new forms, reminding us that the riot is a paradigmatic form among forms. It's not a unitary, unique, singular approach. Elsewhere, I refer to the riot as a circulation struggle, and if you want to know what I mean by that, we can talk about it afterwards. That would sort of be a side conversation. So back to the trolley. The trolley coming down the street, the dead of materialism coming due, must thusly be the strike, not the riot. Or so it appears. But the thought problem has a race problem. In the United States, riot and strike are raced black and white, respectively. Now, I'm not claiming this is true. Latino labor militancy and a long supply of, for example, white riots testify to the contrary. Nonetheless, we need to think only of the insistent use of the very category race riot and how we understand it against the aggressive racism of the AFL craft unions, which succeeded in deferring the formation of any black-led unions until the 1925 Charter of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The decisive entry of African Americans into mass unionization does not come until 1941 UAW strike centered around the River Rouge plant outside Detroit. So in some sense, I'm making a familiar point in noting that this sort of the noble, organized, strategic strike is race white and given higher value and priority as a more serious political act, whereas the riot is raced black, understood as racialized, and given less priority as a less significant political act. Many people have said many terrible things about riots, right? It's shopping on steroids, it's just pure violence, it's chaos, it's thuggery, and so on. But those opinions about strike and riot turn out to underlie or be related to the racial distinction between strike and riot. In some sense, I'm making a familiar point in regard to Marx and Marx's reception, which is itself racialized, which associates like the significant historical power with the agency of a largely white proletariat, and specifically a white proletariat in the industrializing nations. The race riot, contrarily, is spontaneous, subjectivist, disordered, unable to make history, lacking an inner logic. But this critique is foreshortened precisely because the relation of strike and riot changes. It must change. And thus, the racialization in which it is involved is subject to change. And this is the best reason to go to 1967. Not to all the riots, not to all the strikes, but as I said, to the situation of volatile balance, of transformation, as one tactic overtakes the other. The tilting balance is nowhere more apparent than in Newark and Detroit, two cities that successfully industrialize early and concomitantly begin their deindustrialization early in the 50s. Its effects first appearing among non-white workers, according to the last hired, first fired policies that unions held to. Industrialization and surplus population are serial. By surplus population, I mean people who are unemployed and not likely to be absorbed back into the conventional labor force. You get this tilting balance more apparent. New York's two cities that industrialized early. Industrialization and surplus population are serial, overlapping, and inextricable. The population of strike and riot, respectively. In one reading, Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, A Study in Urban Revolution, it's a great history of Detroit, is entirely about this. The Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers are extraordinary apparitions, black labor organizations with avowedly revolutionary horizons. I would argue that they appear and vanish in this very narrow window, 1966 to 73, precisely because they are at once riot and strike. And only in this transitional period is such a thing possible. Even here, the rifts are open. The Revolutionary Union Movement and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers are founded concurrently with the Detroit chapter of the Black Panther Party. In fact, it turns out, it's a fascinating fact, that the Central Committee of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the Central Committee of the Detroit Black Panthers Party, one a labor organization, one, the Black Panthers very avowedly not a labor organization, are the exact same people. It's literally the same group of all men. Literally the same group of African-American men make up the committees of the two simultaneously, which is a bizarre historical fact. Nonetheless, the two groups, in service in part to their national organizations, swiftly fall into conflict with a home chapter along the exact lines of what I'm calling the trolley problem. By 1969, the Detroit chapter of the Panthers has been excluded around these various positions because it is too close to the strike. So because the Panthers, people who are involved in the Panthers are also involved in like strike-making organizations, they get kicked out of the Panthers. That is to say, the confrontation of strike and riot, setting the price of labor and setting the price of market goods and the classical distinction, is mediated through the social struggle in general, but within black militancy in particular. And poetry in the moment cannot escape this particular material problem and the particular ambiguity of materialism, which is at once absolutely real and absolutely in motion. As always, Amiri Baraka, the poet, recognizes the situation with damaging clarity. The Newark riots begin with the beating of John Smith, a cab driver, by police. Baraka will be similarly beaten during the ensuing events. A contemporary piece would be used against him in his trial. The poem Black People, which offers, having surveyed a list of department stores in Newark, his famous formula. Sorry, I think I might slide behind. Yeah, offers his famous formula. All the stores will open up if you say the magic words. The words are, up against the wall, motherfucker, this is a stick-up. For all the talk of Baraka's nationalist openness to violence and the racism and misogyny that seem to adhere to it, less has been said about his theory of riot. He identifies looting, good images of Newark looting, looting, which is say the seizure and price setting of market goods, as a signal tactic. As Tom Hayden will write in his journalistic account of Newark, the riot was more effective against gouging merchants than organized protests had ever been. The year before, a survey was started to check on merchants who weighted their scales. The survey collapsed because of uninterest. People needed power, not proof. The language of magic, the spell that Baraka takes up, I think is profoundly ambiguous in its irony. Looting, and by extension riot, is doubly identified as irrational of itself and or recognizable only as unreason by a white audience. Later, Baraka will take a side. Looting may be materialistic, but it is not materialist, and it is a failure of revolutionary consciousness. His memoirs, to be sure, follow his own traverse from a cultural black nationalism to a Marxist internationalism, and part of what I've been arguing is that his later view is mistaken even according to a Marxist materialism, that deindustrialization, implicit in the dynamic of capital development, perforce moves both the locus of capital and the growing surplus population beyond the abode of production and into the noisy marketplace. Going back to 1967, I want to be attentive to the crucial step Baraka takes. He argues that the repertoire of riot produces blackness itself. This surely is the sense of the term black magic, the name of the collection in which this poem appears. The magic which is the making of blackness, which is the form of struggle from which both theory and poetry, if we must distinguish between the two, arise. That is to say, racial ascription, let us say the bringing someone into the logic of race, ascribing race to them, and ascription of meaning to strikes and riots are conjoined activities. Ruth Wilson Gilmore has provided an eloquent model of racialization for the era of surplus populations in her book Golden Gulag. On the management of black populations since the moment of transformation. She says, the state sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. That for her is what blackness is. Again, I'll say it. The state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. The riot is, like the new prison industrial complex, a specter of this new surplus population living outside the conventional economy as a problem both for racialized groups and for capital. As Baraka suggests, riot both intensifies and inverts the double process, completing the circuit of racialization by insisting that whites must encounter this vulnerability to premature death even as their own, the threat of the riot. This is the reversal of 1967. As the strike and riot swap places, the latter taking on a logic of necessity, of determination, a riot suddenly understood as produced by history rather than an outburst aside from history, produced, given a logic by the transformations of capital, then racialization must also switch. Whiteness must see itself not in the trolley coming down the street, remember that was the strike in our allegory, and whiteness sees itself in the strike is coded white, but this starts to change. Whiteness must see itself not in the trolley coming down the street, but in the man or group of men who are in its path, one way or another. If this reversal is implicit in Baraka, it is explicit in Gwendolyn Brooks. That's Gwendolyn Brooks' poem Riot, one of the greatest poems ever written, who saw Baraka perform that year and wrote her own poem Riot 2 years later. She identifies her poem as a response to the riots of 1968, following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. She begins the poem with a study in whiteness at its most rarefied, with the most Brahmin name on offer, John Cabot, all white, blue rose beneath his golden hair. Now the turns and inversions come thick and fast. Riot is set in 160 cities, but it is also set in Newark, the city that deindustrialized early on in the 50s, sending its industrial workers into service work, into circulation sector, a canary in the national coal mine. John Cabot's name must be paired with John Smith, not the Jamestown captain, but the Newark cabbie, almost certainly a slave name, John Smith, whose beating sets off the Newark riots, who was subsequently charged in classic fashion with assaulting an officer, and who is, in a story followed nationally, convicted of assaulting an officer to start the Newark riots 3 days before King's murder, a largely forgotten moment in the events. So there is John Cabot, who is so white he is almost French. And there is John Smith. The two Johns, both outside the good old productive economy, albeit in opposite directions, are in a riot. But that's not quite right. It is John Smith necessarily, but in the truth of the text, it is the Negroes. From John Cabot's perspective, they become an it, which is blackness itself, both abstract and particular, and so unavoidable and fatal on its course toward him. And it is not quite that they are all in a riot. The poem's great drama comes in the middle. Fred Moten has said in reference to this moment that Negroes coming down the street is the constancy of riot, and poetry is a way of arranging that constancy. This is in a conversation, and I'm paraphrasing, but not terribly, I hope. I think this is largely right. The Negroes are the riot. But here constancy gets strange. The riot has changed. It is coming down the street with ineluctable force, with determination, not detainable and not discreet, and John Cabot is stuck in its tracks. If you ever want to just do Google image search for the trolley problem, you get all kinds of crazy images. That's just one of them. The riot is now the determined, the organized, by history, if not also by its participants. It has become historical. The balance of forces has shifted. The riot is now, in 1967, the trolley. And the poem is the way of organizing this inconstancy, the exposure to these transformations. And if the racialization of the riot, raced as black and racially ascriptive, making blackness if you participate in a riot, if this is not changed, the meaning of blackness has itself been transformed. Itself been transformed in this change from not trolley to trolley, from disorder to historicity. Blackness itself no longer stands as the disorganized, the chaotic, disorder, ahistoricality, but as the force of history bearing down the tracks on whiteness. One last turn before I finish. I'm going to go back to the trolley problem, Philippa Foot's version of it that she writes in 1967. It turns out that it's not a trolley problem at all, not really. In Foot's original formulation, the trolley is the third variation that she gives. It becomes famous, but it is not, in fact, her original proposition. The second version she gives concerns a crashing airplane, which also calls upon us to make this ethical decision, which will be the bridge to the trolley formation. But what's the first? The very original formulation she offers, in which people have to figure out what the ethical response is to this onrushing threat of death, which has to be somehow dealt with and staved off. It turns out the trolley problem was always a riot problem. The first original formulation of this famous ethical conundrum is qualitatively different. Ethics have a funny way of turning out to be historically grounded politics, and that too is a kind of poetic materialism. So what I want to end with, I'm actually now done, is just a note that the particular lived actual social experience of the threat of people racialized black threatening the white order as represented by a judge and so on, and the response being necessary to how that will be dealt with might be seen not as an ethical problem at all, but as a fundamental historical issue that arises in this moment in the 60s and has in many ways returned to us today. As I suggested, the events in Missouri just in the last couple of days have reminded us of exactly the structure of this problem and reminded us of sort of our relationship in our present moment toward those earlier moments of riot, something that's on very much on everyone's mind, including Time Magazine and white America in general. Thank you very much for sitting through that, and I'm now happy to sort of talk it through, answer questions, clarify things, disclarify things, disavow things. Stare at each other. Yeah, back row.
That trolley experiment, have you, it's kind of been posted on like some brain analysis tests, and kind of one changed the formula up a little, which wondering if you could relate at all, where instead of having to flip a switch to decide who gets killed, you have to, the idea was that you had to push someone in the way of the train in order to stop it and save those lives.
Well, so there's a couple ways to answer that note. Yeah, there's actually a vast number of variations of the trolley problem. There's one of the best known, there's many books about the trolley problem. One of the best known about is called, if I recall correctly, Do you have to kill the fat guy? Since that one version of the problem is, in fact, it's important that the person you're pushing in that narrative is fat. Why that's important? He has a shorter life expectancy. There's all kinds of variations, right? That you can sort of play it out. Like, well, what if the person you have to push in front of the trolley is your mother, right? And there's a book about that, right? It's actually, this has generated endless. People love these abstract ethical games. They sit around and they're like, either they're like, oh my God, I'm so virtuous because I will do X, or oh my God, the world is so complicated. Those are two different satisfactions, right? But related. I feel like this microphone just stopped working.
Just died.
The lights don't work. The batteries don't, yeah. I'm a little worried that they're not going to get their record of the event, but that's okay. Now we can talk about all kinds of stuff. But you know, for me, the question is not so much like, oh, the trolley problem, so complicated, what about this variation, but about the ways in which it provides an allegory. For me, what I'm really interested in, it's a terrible way to start a sentence, I need to like track. For me, something that I find really fascinating is the way that these abstract problems that people create actually are expressions of much more complicated lived experiences, right? And that's what I want to do, is abstract out, not like, oh, because that trolley problem thing, probably none of us will ever have to actually make that decision. I hope, but probably not. Although you can see, right, so at the first sort of level of abstracting it out, it's like, well, but we always have to make these utilitarian decisions. It's better like, this will cause a certain amount of harm, this will cause a certain amount of harm, can we compare them, how do we choose? Even that sort of remains the level of ethics. The thing I'm interested in, right, is that A, I can use that as an allegory for thinking about this other sort of set of problems that are much more in our lived experience of people fighting in the streets that are actually happening, right? The last year has been a year of astonishing riots, mostly what we used to call race riots, right? Ferguson twice, in August and then in November. That was a national set of riots when they didn't indict the cop from Ferguson. And then Baltimore, one of the more massive riots in history. So I'm interested in the way that it turns out that this very abstract problem, even at the moment of its inception, by a Cambridge professor, Cambridge, England, living in a fairly hermetic world, advancing this quite abstract, formal problem, actually can't stop telling the story for a moment, right? It turns out to be a story about like, oh no, there's a riot, and they're coming, and they're out of control, and a judge has to make a decision, and someone's hostage, which is, you know, close to an actual lived story that we keep on seeing over and over again when some black kid has been arrested, he hasn't been shot yet, maybe he's going to die in jail. And so I'm really interested in the way that even that abstract problem can't stay an abstract problem, that keeps leaking back into the actual political struggles people are having in the streets. So for me, that's the drama, not so much the puzzling through all the variations of the trolley problem itself. Although it's interesting, like the self-driving car question, which is exactly like, do you know, like, there you are in your self-driving car. I don't know, do we sit in the back seat? People understand what happens when we have self-driving cars?
It's fun seat. You have to sit in the front seat.
You have to, for now.
Yeah, well, that's the law right now.
So the car, it has to be programmed, right? So like it's driving down a street and it's suddenly someone leaps out and it can't stop in time, so it has to either keep going or swerve. And then, you know, the blinker eye on the side checks how many people are over there, like how many people are over there? Well, there's 3 people over there. But, you know, does the blinker eye incredibly quickly get into their Facebook feed and determine whether they're decent people or not? And like, right, so it's interesting that this programming, this abstract problem has become one that people do have to puzzle out. But I'm not very interested in that part. I'm interested in riots. Yeah.
Would you be able to go back to the riot graph that kind of goes
That's the strike graph.
The strike graph, yes.
I believe I have that power.
Awesome.
There's buttons,
Yeah.
and those buttons work. Oh my God, so many slides. There it is.
Sweet. All right, so this entire concept, this is how I'm taking an interpretation of what you're saying. I could be entirely wrong, but it's
I'm also entirely wrong.
yeah, it's all perception. Riots unified racialization of black people almost, but then this is what I'm saying. It gave them a unified in 1968. But then, if we look at African American culture, it's very competitive. We see this in hip hop, and we see this in gang violence and stuff like that. So it comes from this unification into this more competitive zone, and then it cycles back into this unification again. So I just want to kind of, I don't know what the question is in there, but maybe your thoughts on that, because it seems like they're standing together against their oppressors, but then they're manipulated into being combative against themselves. Like we see in hip hop, it's always about like me always being better than you, and this is what I have, and this is what you don't have. And even with gang violence, I think the introduction of capital, kind of made it more hostile.
I'm wondering if anyone in the room has a response to that. I always have things to say. I'm literally trained to have things to say. That's the entirety of my professional training. But I'm wondering if anyone else in the room has thoughts on that question? Well, I'm curious to hear what people think. My initial response is, I don't actually recognize the thing you're describing in hip hop and gang culture. I don't actually think I'm an expert in gangs of any race or racialized category. I kind of am an expert in hip hop. I actually published a bunch of stuff about it. I wrote my master's thesis about it, so I know a decent amount about that. I just don't accept that I don't recognize the characterization of it all. It's competitive. It comes from a tradition of boasting, including a game that was common in African American subcultures called the Dozens, which involves like both boasting and insults, but actually dates back far longer. The sort of original version of the Dozens that we know of historically are rhyming contests where poets insult each other in Wales and Iceland in the 9th and 10th centuries. It's a very long-standing tradition. My understanding of people in Wales and Iceland in the 9th and 10th century, they're super white. And in terms of like that culture being about competition, in my experience of it, which is all I can speak from, it doesn't come anything close to the competition I've seen in corporations where people are competing for positions, in department meetings among me and my colleagues. In places like that, I find the competition much more intense and destructive. Now, in some sense, I agree with elements of what you're saying. I think that capital sets people at each other's throats and has to. This is an incredibly important fact. This is an incredibly important fact, which I want to linger on for a moment, right? A lot of people want to explain what goes wrong with capitalism according to greed. Well, some people are greedy, right? I want to assure you that greed has nothing to do with it. How much? 0. Now, I'm not saying people aren't greedy. Some of them are, whatever that means. But here's the deal, right? I own a sweater selling shop. You can imagine that, right? And Rick owns a sweater selling shop. We are set up on opposite corners selling sweaters. And the thing is, Rick actually has bought a new machine for making sweaters. He calls it the Sweaterator. It's pretty efficient. It allows him to make sweaters more cheaply. So he can I sell my sweaters for $50. He starts selling his for $45, right? But it costs him less to make the sweaters because he has the Sweaterator. So he's still making as much of a profit as I am, but selling it for less. Now you're all sweater buyers, and none of you are stupid. They're the same sweaters. You're like, I'm going to go 45. It's not like some of you will go for that. All of you go to Rick's store, and I go out of business, right? The end. Well, not the end. If I'm an excellent businessman, I'm going to get a Sweaterator 2. Even more efficient, lower my cost for sweater making. So I can sell sweaters for $40 and still make a profit. And now Rick's regarding business. So we're compelled to do these things by competition, right? It doesn't matter if I'm greedy. I might be the sweetest person in the world, good to my family, I don't kick dogs, all that. I'm an adorable person. This is not really true. This is it's a fantasy story. I'm adorable. I still have no choice, even as an adorable person, but to buy the Sweaterator 2, right? To buy the Sweaterator 2. Here's the thing about the Sweaterator 2. It's more efficient. It's more productive. You know what that means? That has only one meaning. It means it takes less people, right? The Sweaterator 2 replaces 4 of my employees, whereas the Sweaterator 1 only replaced 2 of his employees. So he's taught me to pay a bunch of employees. I get to get rid of that wage cost. So actually, I just fired 4 people. They're unemployed now. It's unclear how they're going to get food. Because I'm greedy? No. Because if I don't keep up with Rick, I go out of business. and then I can't feed my family. So competition, this is what I'm getting at. I don't think it's racialized at all. I mean, you sort of want it to be racialized, and for me it's not. But competition is absolutely the truth of the world we live in. Enforced, compelled competition, regardless of what kind of people we are. So I do agree that competition is a driving factor. I don't then start looking like, oh, what kind of people are this culture, that culture. I get very nervous about that. I see you have a follow-up. I'm going to let you have it, and then I'm going to move on to other people.
Oh, you're gonna let me have it?
Absolutely.
Sweet. All right. So, in response to what
See,
you
I'm
said,
adorable.
yeah, in response to what you said, so you made note about how like hip hop had like almost Icelandic origins and like Caucasian origins.
I did not say that at all, actually,
Oh,
but okay.
you did.
I just said there's examples of that kind of performance where people talk shit about each other and try to outcompete each other in verse. Those go back for a millennia. That's all. I didn't say it comes from one to the other.
So awesome. All right. So this entire idea. So I guess I'm trying to justify this racialization of competition kind of through the commodification of slavery. This is what my entire thesis is about, which is why I find this very interesting. In essence, like African American culture per se, or the racialized version of like dissociation of African American culture through the commodification of slavery, made it a more competitive culture. This is kind of what I interpret. So from that, like hip hop and gang culture, it's I kind of want to say that it's never mind. No, I'm done.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd be interested to talk to you about that at length, and maybe talk to your advisor too. And I'm curious as to whether this argument flies. I would think, as an initial thought, right, that in fact the competition would be among the slavers, right? Like I'm not quite clear why in the narrative of slavery, which is a struggle for economic dominance among a bunch of capitalists in the South, in the U.S., in the United States story, not the global story. The competition is more or less between them. I'm not quite sure what the other.
I think it's more of every man for themselves in terms of slavery. Like in the book Every Beloved, it's always the characters who are slaves are always fighting for themselves opposed to their families. Like there's this one scene where a man is watching his wife get raped by 9 slave owners, and he stands there helplessly. He doesn't do anything. And that's almost a form of, I take that as a form of competition of him putting his self-interest and his survival as a priority in that form as competition.
Yeah, I have a pretty different reading of that book, but we should maybe leave that for. Yeah. Maybe we can get drinks later on. And I mean, who here's read Beloved? It's a very common book in college. For me, that book is actually one of the things it's about is this structures by which people, including the slaves, including the African Americans in the book, do horrible things exactly not out of competition. The truly horrible thing that happens in the book, and I'm not going to say what it is because spoilers, but the truly horrible thing that happens in the book happens because of the opposite of competition. Someone does a horrible thing as a desperate attempt to not be forced into a competition that harms someone else. So I have quite a different sense of that book, but boy, it's a compelling book. And if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, we will. More questions? I can see you anxious to ask a question.
I haven't formulated my question completely in my head yet.
You have time. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about this binary you seem to set up between strike and riot.
Yes.
Do you believe that they are always oppositional forces, or are there times and spaces where these two forms mingle? I was thinking about some of the events in Mizzou where the football team that's a strike.
Boy, this is a great question. This is a great question. Keep going.
But before that, I think at the homecoming parade, the president's car was stopped by students, and that seemed to be akin to they're instances that are part of the same movement, and nobody seems to be criticizing the other's action. And then I'm also thinking
What's your
about,
name?
I'm Margaret.
I'm Margaret.
Hi.
Keep going.
I'm also thinking about marches, which seem to have elements of both riot and strike. Because like a strike, they're very organized, but like a riot, they're extremely disruptive. There are a large number of people taking up a large amount of space, but it's still not viewed as, it's not labeled a riot, it's not viewed as scary in the same way a riot is. So I kind of...
That's an amazing question, and the bad news is, it's going to take me a little while to answer it. Do y'all have the patience for me to sort of work through that? Is that okay? Because there's not a short answer to that question. Thank you very much. So I think the first thing we have to do is actually closely define strike and riot, which has proved to be a huge problem for people. As it happens, I just read a whole bunch of, okay, so spoiler, I have a book coming out in the spring called Riot, Strike, Riot, which is about this question. So I read a lot of books trying to define what a riot. A strike is usually pretty easy to define. Usually, people can define it pretty well. It involves work stoppage, shutting down a production process, interfering with the profits of someone, right? Riots are much harder to define, and over and over in the literature, they're defined by violence, by the presence of violence. This is a terrible definition. When someone gives that, and again, it's a racist definition, but it's also a terrible definition. Those two things often go together. That assignment of like, oh, riots, they're violent, out of control, yada yada. Whereas strikes, right, calm, organized, a plan is made, people march, they have signs, they're calm. This is not what happened in history. The Colorado Miners' War of 1914, which involved mass bloodshed, it was called a war, was a strike. They started as a miners' strike and burst into open war with the early version of the National Guard, among private police, various things. Strikes historically are incredibly violent. Even when they're not openly violent, they always have implicit violence. They always have the threat that the workers can destroy the machines. They always have that threat that things, and often they do. So that's actually a bad distinction. It's like riots are violent, strikes are calm and organized. A much better distinction is offered to us from this guy, E.P. Thompson, who writes about strikes and riots in the 18th and 19th centuries, which works really well for a while, but not to the present. His distinction is a majestic distinction is, and I referred to it a couple times in the talk, is riots are about setting the price of goods in the marketplace. That's how they begin, the bread riot, right? Where like people are starving, and there's a famine, and the people who sell bread or any grain or jack up the price because they want to make super profits, and people start to starve, and they go down to the baker, or the seller of bread, or the person or the miller, or the merchant who ships grain for a higher price to the next county, and they said, you can't do this anymore. We insist you sell bread for a reasonable price. In fact, we're just going to take your bread. That's the zero price, right? And so this is the history of riots, is price setting in the marketplace, which looting is a remnant. People think looting is like a weird aberration, like it's the bad part of the riot, but really, no. It's the truth. Looting is the truth. Looting is the entire history of riots. The entire history of riots is people not having stuff they need and going down to get it. And then the strike is the setting of the price of your labor, right? It's a demand for a wage increase or better working conditions, which comes out to the same thing in the end. So there are different demands, right? And that's how you can distinguish a riot and a strike. A riot is a demand for lower prices in the marketplace. A strike is a demand for a higher price for labor. What does that tell us then about the current riots, which actually don't seem to involve, except for the episodes of looting, a demand for lower prices, right? There's no more bread riots, really. Not in our country. There still are bread riots in many places in the world, what we used to call the third world, very poor places in the world, but not in the US, not in France, not in Germany, not in England. In early industrializing, high-wage nations, you don't really get bread riots anymore. Very, very rarely. So how can, why are that's a great question, which is underlying the question you asked, I think, which is why are riots now about race? In the new era of riots, why are they about race? And that was one of the things I was sort of pointing at in the talk, that I think you sort of heard the echoes of, right, is, well, it's still about the space of the market, which is to say, it's still about people who are no longer part of the labor force, right? The logic of the strike is the logic of being part of the labor force. We start to generate massive unemployment, surplus population. So African American youth in the United States, age is 18-25, average unemployment is 50%. You got me? 50%. Half the youth, black youth, between 18-25, unemployed. That's exclusion from the labor market, right? And at that point, the strike is impossible. If you're surplus population, you can't strike. And so the riot becomes the form in which struggle becomes possible. So now, having set up those terms, I can sort of start to move towards the specifics of your question. Yes, they absolutely can collude. In fact, it seems very obvious that sometimes strikes spill over into things like riots. It's actually very common in China right now, which is a different kind of labor market. Things will start as strikes in factories, and they'll go into the streets, and they'll turn into looting, and one turns into the other. In the question of Missouri, Mizzou, I like you say that. You're more in touch with it than I am. We'd have to ask all kinds of complicated questions. Was that really a strike? Like, when students say we're going to have a student strike and we're not going to go to class anymore, is that really a strike? Well, it's a strike if they don't pay their fees. Yes, maybe. Except your education is kind of a consumer good. Think about this for a second. Right? You pay a bunch of money for a good that you need to get through life, or at least people convince you think you need, and you pay a bunch of money for it. It's a consumer good. Your education is not like going to work, it's like bread. And if you start to struggle over the terms of that, that's actually much closer to a riot than a strike. You're struggling over if you have a tuition strike to demand lowering of tuition, that's actually a riot. You're demanding a lower cost for those goods. Because in these spaces which are not factory spaces, like the university, famously not a factory, and actually doesn't work like a factory, those things get confused. Riot and strike often get very confused and mixed up. So the thing you point to is true, right? The university is probably the military too, is a space where riot and strike are very hard to tell apart, because it's not like a strike isn't the same as like, we're downing our tools and stopping the production process. We will not make sweaters anymore. We've had it with Rick. Sorry to do it that guy. I know you know. So these things get very confused in the university space, and where we can start to collude and overlap. They often, I expect we'll see them colluding and overlapping more and more, but there is a reason we start to see the strike this is an industrial strike, right? This wouldn't refer to like football strikes. We started to see these almost entirely disappear. Now, I'm actually getting to where I think is the most interesting part of your question is about the march. You still with me? We okay? Can I have 4 minutes more on this question? 6 minutes more? The march. So I think the march isn't either one. I think the protest is its own category, but it has a deep relation to Berthism and a particularly deep relation to the riot that I want to talk about for a second. So what are the most famous examples of protests that you know of in American history? Someone? Anyone?
Vietnam War.
Vietnam War, huge protests. Others?
March on Washington
Which one?
in 1963.
The topic was?
Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King, right? So civil rights, civil rights movement was like one of the most famous U.S. episodes of like nonviolent protest, right? Actually, it's quite violent, but its reputation was for being nonviolent, and that's certainly one. Yeah, background.
I'm not certain if this counts, but at the beginning of the Great Depression, when banks were
Closing.
yeah, trying to say this specifically. Can't think of the exact details though. details after that. There was a lot of issues then too. Would that be considered rioting or?
No, I mean, I don't think they were big. I mean, those weren't really like political protests in the way we experience them now. They weren't. They actually, interestingly, they weren't very large-scale protests in response to McCarthyism, because no one really wanted to. There just wasn't that many people who wanted to get down with the communists who were hypothetically being repressed.
I meant to say Hooverville.
Hooverville. Well, so Hoovervilles are, okay, different topic. Hoovervilles are not protests. Hoovervilles are where people who are out of work end up because they have no place to live and they're super poor, of which Occupy turns out to be a later example in certain ways. Different conversation, bracket, we can come back to it.
Would you include the 1919 riots in Chicago?
Well, those are riots. Those are across the country. That was the first, that was the so-called red hot summer, right, which is where there's a lot of race riots and there's a lot of anti-communist riots. Like the race riots in 1919 are all start with white people beating African American people and attacking communists. And then there's some response to those. And those are very interesting moments of which one of the great riot poems of all time, If We Must Die by Claude McKay, gets written out of that. But so, anyway, to get back to the March question, we're sort of, it's my fault. I'm letting it sort of wander around, and I really don't want to answer the March question. So, still, I'll take civil rights. Of the various examples, civil rights is an excellent example. Civil rights was a pretty effective protest movement. It actually won a lot of ground. It wasn't as nonviolent as one might have us believe. MLK really wanted it to be nonviolent. So, for example, the Watts riots in '65, huge riots. Martin Luther King says, oh, those were not race riots. Those were commodity riots. And so is he recognizing the wisdom of Marx? I don't think so. I think he really wants the racial struggle to be a nonviolent struggle. So when it turns violent, he wants to make it not about race. And so he identifies those not as race riots, because he really wants the civil rights movement to be nonviolent. It's fairly nonviolent, and it wins some real concessions. Not as much as anyone would want, but some real concessions. Let's compare that to the largest marches in the history of the world. Anyone happen to know the largest marches in the history of the world? 2003, fairly recent. Against the war, against the U.S. invasion of first Afghanistan and then a series of other countries after that. And the collection of marches that happened globally in February 2003 are the largest marches globally in the history of the world. How much effect did they have? I'm estimating. None, right? In fact, marches in general don't seem to have much effect anymore in the way that they did, and we can ask why is that. But before we ask why is that, I want to note something about the 50s, civil rights, and what happened in Ferguson. So every time there's a huge riot, this is almost universally true, every time there's a huge riot, the people involved fraction. And on the one side, there's people who want to sort of build the movement, and they want to be peaceful, and they want to look good, and they want to look good in the media, and they want to gain a sort of more popular front, and they want to enlarge their numbers. These are all reasonable desires. And they want to make demands and win concessions. And that dictates a certain kind of politics, right? That dictates nonviolence, that dictates being sort of media friendly, having dignity, claims for justice. And then there's a side that's like, no, actually, we want to seriously fuck shit up. The stuff that's destroying us, we want to destroy it. The power of the police, which is killing us nonstop, we want to break that power. The power of goods that we can't afford to stay alive, we want to seize those goods. Right? And so that split always happens. It always happens. In civil rights, we can describe it as a split between MLK and Malcolm X, but it always happens. And for a long time, that first team, what we'll call the discursive team, right? They want to argue, they want to make a point, they want to convince, they want to persuade, they want to grow, almost always wins, very quickly. Right? There's a debate between the two sides, and that first team wins, and the riot ends. The riot ends, and it turns into marches. That really works in the 50s. They win lots of games through that nonviolent stuff. It doesn't work anymore. Period, little economic history, the period 1947 to 1973 is the greatest boom in the history of the world. Capitalism in America has never done as well as it does in that period. Huge social surpluses generated, massive profit rates in industrial and manufacturing sectors are over 6%, historically huge. There's a lot of surplus money, and it's worth it for the government to buy the peace. They have the money, they purchase the peace. You get war on the streets, and you get protests, and they purchase the social peace. with social programs, with welfare, with unemployment benefits, with food stamps. They purchased the social peace. And then they stopped having the money. The best year economically since 1973 is worse than the worst year, 47 to 73. The surplus goes away. The government can't buy the peace anymore, and marches stop working. People still march. They don't get anything from it. And that's why the march has lost its charm it had. That's what happened after Ferguson, right? If you followed Ferguson in August of last year, those riots lasted for 3 weeks. No one could figure it out. Like, why didn't they end up, you know how big Ferguson is? 21,000 people. Very small town. Like, why did it go for 3 weeks? Because the side that usually wins the debate, which is we must be peaceful, we must be dignified, we must present ourselves in a way that wins over the, and we'll win concessions from that. We'll get social concessions. Everyone knows the concessions aren't coming anymore. It's not winnable. There's not going to be any new deal. There's not going to be any new set of social dispensations and social wages. I'm sorry. Your generation in particular is fucked. I'm sorry, but they're not coming. And that's why more and more, that's another way to narrate why we see the rise of the riot, right? It's because the other strategy is now empty. It can't get those wins. So the march stands in a funny relation to the riot. The march is one of the things that happens to a riot to sort of pacify and neutralize it, usually. And it can happen less and less. We'll see fewer and fewer of that, those kinds of, oh, people will still try it. It's still very appealing, right? That moral pull of like, no, don't be violent, be good people. The great moral pull, like, oh, we want to be good, we'll march, we'll hold signs. People still, these are all like, you know, there's a category, the repertoire of actions, and it includes all these things. And people will try lots of them. In moments of distress, people will try this and try that in the space of a week or a couple of weeks or 3 weeks. I'm sort of interested in more like longer spans. Like over the course of 10 years, are we going to see a lot of marches? Not so much. But at any given moment, when you have a community in real distress, people try all that shit. People will try strikes if they can figure out a way to pull them off, if they have jobs. People will try riots, people will try marches. Communities in distress try what they have to try because they're really trying to live. Or that was a long answer to a great question. I'm sorry for going on so long.
And I think probably a good place to stop, and thank you, Joshua, for your time. People have time to recover, come back at 7 for the poetry
Maybe some poems about riots.
side of riots. And thank you all.